All right, everybody, welcome. I am Benjamin Mako-Hill. I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of Communication, and welcome to the Thomas Scheidel lecture. Thomas Scheidel, I'll tell you a little bit about the lecture. So Thomas Scheidel was faculty in the Department of Communication for 20 years. He was also an associate dean and the department chair twice. He was inducted to the UW Alumni Hall of Fame in 2014. This lecture series honors his lifetime of scholarship, teaching, and academic leadership here at UW, and has occurred annually since 1998. It's the most important lecture of each year here in the Department of Communication, and every year it brings a distinguished scholar to campus. You can see the impressive list of people who've given this talk on the plaque outside in the hall afterwards, where the reception will be held. I am proud and thrilled to be able to introduce Professor Darren Gergle, who will be giving the 2017 Thomas Scheidel lecture. Dr. Gergle received his PhD from Carnegie Mellon at the Human-Computer Interaction Institute. He has collected a book on usability on the web. He's written a large number of journal articles, a pile of book chapters, and many, many articles published in computer science conference proceedings. I gave up counting both the number of articles and the number of best paper awards that those articles have received. His body of work is both enormous and deeply influential within communication research on technology and social behavior, and as well as in computer science research in computer and human interaction and computer-supported cooperative work. And I see lots of people from all of those areas in the room. He has spent his career at Northwestern, where he is a professor in the Department of Communication Studies, and where he also holds a courtesy appointment in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. At Northwestern, he runs the Collab Lab, which one of your students told me last week he was pushing to get named Lab Lab. I thought it failed. Some of that group's work, I'm sure a lot of that group's work will be showcasing here in his talk. He's also the director of the PhD program in technology and social behavior at Northwestern, which is kind of a cooperative program that spans the communication department and the computer science department. He's a co-chair of the Faculty Research Council at the Segal Design Institute, a faculty associate at the Northwestern University Cognitive Science program, and a fellow at the Communications Residential College. So that's a very short version of his kind of official bio. But what I wanted to tell you, I also wanted to tell you a little bit about what Darren and his scholarship has meant to me as a scholar. So like Darren, my own work spans the fields of communication and computer science. And like Darren, I have a background in sort of computer science and engineering. I did my PhD at MIT, which you probably don't know, but MIT does not have a communication department. Some of you will know that. And I struggled early on in graduate school to sort of find a community of scholars whose substantive and methodological interests really aligned with mine. And some advice I got at the time from my advisors was to find the scholarly conversations that I wanted to be part of, and to find the scholars who were doing the kind of work that I wanted to do, and to having the kind of impact that I wanted, and to try to connect myself with that, or go to the kinds of places that they were. So Darren was one of the scholars that really inspired me then, at that period, and he was, when I was a student, and continues to be today, a leading voice in an academic conversation that I wanted to join then, which I think I have joined subsequently. His work is a big part of how I came to realize that communication as a field and as a discipline was a place that I wanted to be, and where I've been very happy. Now, a little bit of a change of pace, but a lot of, as you'll see here, a lot of Darren's work, especially recently, has been about Wikipedia. And Wikipedians, that's what they call themselves. There's a few of you in the audience. They have a lot of strange rules and traditions, some of which Darren will probably talk to us about. Before he does that, I want to introduce you to one of those traditions. So the tradition, which happens on English Wikipedia and in many, but not all, other language versions of Wikipedia, is giving what are called Barn Stars. So a Barn Star is a social award. It's a digital picture of a metal star, which it's a decorative star, which is traditionally put on the side of a barn, hence Barn Star. You may have seen real ones. They are given by any Wikipedian to any other Wikipedian for any reason at any time. Giving a barn star is as simple as just leaving a message on that other person's kind of what's called talk page, that's on their kind of like message page, saying, I give you this barn star and here's the reason. Although there's no limit to the number of barn stars that anyone can give, they are treated by Wikipedians as kind of the highest form of award, I think you'd say, or the essential form of award. And they're extremely rare, as I've learned in some of my empirical work. They're a symbol of gratitude and respect from one Wikipedian to another. And when they're given, you usually explain why. They've become within Wikipedia like an insider symbol of Wikipedia culture. I know half a dozen Wikipedians who have their barn stars, or barn stars tattooed on their body. And they're also, they're a really big deal. They're also particularly meaningful to me. When I gave my job talk in this department 4 years ago, I talked about barn stars. Some research that I had done with barn stars. If you've seen the big red star that's on my Twitter page on the back of my laptop, that's a barn star. So, in addition to getting your name on the plaque, Darren, I want to award you, Darren Gergle, this physical barn star. For your work studying Wikipedia and for your work bridging the gap between communication studies and computer science so that a new generation of computational communication scholars with a foot in computing a group that definitely includes myself, can build on your work to push forward communication research. Thank you so much, and Professor Darren Gergle.
Great, thank you.
Well, it was worth coming here just for that introduction. That's the nicest introduction I think I've ever had. This is the best award I've ever received as well, too. I'm delighted to have this. I don't know if I can get it through airport security, but I'm going to give it a shot.
That's a problem. Yeah.
It's truly an honor and a privilege to be here today and to be able to speak to you and to be part of the Scheidel lecture series. And I also know that for many of us on the quarter system, it's a particularly tough time of year. So many of you are coming from or heading to, and I know some colleagues that aren't here are currently at conferences. So thank you for taking the time to come here and hear what I have to say today. One of the things that I've examined for and thought about and researched for a long time, and which continues to play a big role in my work, is this idea of common ground and how people come to establish shared meaning and shared understanding. Particularly, I've done this through conversational and interactive exchanges, and I've looked at it really at small group level, kind of interpersonal group level. But the work that I want to present today is work where we began to take some of these ideas and try to scale them up. To ask some of these questions around things like community co-membership and knowledge representation as it exists in large-scale peer production environments. And so for today's talk, what I want to focus on specifically is examining the role that language and language-based communities play on Wikipedia's content diversity. And I'm going to discuss, in particular, I think, a range of interesting biases that can get embedded into the data that's present on different Wikipedia language editions, and then talk briefly about how these biases influence downstream technologies. And then I want to close with, on a positive note, and talk about how we can actually take advantage of this and begin to think differently about the ways in which we design and develop technologies that actually support and take advantage of a lot of that diversity that we see. Okay. So I think whether we'd like to admit it or not, did we want to turn the thing down or no? They mentioned that before, so. Yeah. Oh, there we go. Okay, that's great. So whether we'd like to admit it or not, I'd argue that Wikipedia is one of the most important information resources of our time. And I don't mean this necessarily as a scholarly resource, but I do mean this as a first place that a lot of people go to learn about a new subject or a new topic. And I think as a result of this, there's been a great deal of scholarship examining Wikipedia. So this is studies that range from things like coordination and collaboration processes of Wikipedia editors to trying to understand ways to increase contributions and participation and make those contributions better, kind of more accurate, more comprehensive, and as well as studies of things like topical coverage and the kinds of contribution biases that we see. But in addition to the social science aspects of trying to understand some of the organizational context and the ways in which these collaborations work and interact, it's also really important to note that Wikipedia data structures themselves have become commonplace as the brains behind a lot of AI and natural language processing applications. Right? So things like text categorization, search and retrieval systems, computational means for doing something like calculating the relatedness between two concepts or two entities. A lot of this relies on data that's coming from Wikipedia. Right? So these Wikipedia data structures are really important for these AI and NLP applications. However, until relatively recently, the vast majority of this research has been done on the English Wikipedia. But in fact, there's currently 285 plus active Wikipedia language editions right now. And I'd argue then that an implicit and problematic assumption of a lot of that earlier work, much of it being some of my own and some of the work that's come out of our lab, is that there's this assumption that people in different parts of the world, speaking different languages, essentially have access to the same information, they participate and they coordinate in similar ways, and they exhibit similar types of coverage biases across language editions. Right? By only focusing on English, we're sort of trying to generalize to the way these processes work kind of across the board. And that's something that we've been thinking about for a while and kind of critiquing. And furthermore, this is really important as we begin to think about things like the global nature of knowledge repositories such as Wikipedia. So we need to think critically, I think, as researchers and as developers about things like equitable information access, retaining diverse perspectives and providing what I would argue is truly global coverage, so understanding a concept and how different people think about that differently. And then in particular, the interaction that occurs between this data, this peer-produced data that's being produced by the communities, and the algorithms that are processing those data. And in particular, the resulting role that this plays for information structure, its representation, and ultimately its availability for consumption. So on this last point, in particular, I think we can begin to think about things like there's a lot of talk these days about algorithmic biases, and we have algorithmic biases coupled with things like selective exposure processes that can lead to biased forms of media presentation and information presentation, as well as consumption. I'm sorry?
I think you better track that.
Oh.
Just,
This.
sorry to interrupt everyone.
Good. So things like selective exposure coupled with these algorithmic biases can lead to various forms of biased information presentation and consumption. And so we need to be thinking about how all of these things kind of interoperate. So when we began to do this work, we realized that we really needed new conceptual perspectives, some new methods, and some new tools. So what I want to do today is try to talk about three major things. First, I want to demonstrate some ways that we've developed to study content diversity and biases that exist across language editions of Wikipedia. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to demonstrate what this diversity of representations and these biases, how they can influence other end-user technologies. And then I want to briefly present what I'm referring to as kind of a new class of technologies that are enabled by the diversity of representations that are available. So in starting on this work, we began, I think, where any reasonable academic would. We reviewed the work of one of the great philosophers of our time. So Stephen Colbert, in the Colbert Report, introduced this idea of wikiality. And it's a form of bias in which users redefine the world according to their own personal views. So the quote here is the reality that exists if you make something up and enough people agree with you. That's not as funny as it used to be about 8 months ago, but I still think it's pretty good. But to demonstrate this, then, he urged his audience to go to the Wikipedia article on African elephants and to revise the entry to say that their population had tripled in the last 6 months. And such an entry would then serve as something of an inconvenient tusk for Al Gore and his friends in the environmental movement. And so while this sketch was definitely intended as a comedic piece, I think it actually raises some really important issues when we think about peer production content that we've explored in our work. And that's to what extent do inherent biases based on shared personal opinions exist in community-maintained knowledge repositories? Right? And this is one place where language fractures. We get different communities, and we can begin to kind of investigate this and try to understand this. All right, so we started with what I thought was a pretty simple research question over 5 years ago at this point, where I thought, oh, we can answer this in we should be done in a couple months. It's several years later, we're still kind of working on this problem, but it was really just to sort of start out by saying, to what extent is there content diversity amongst the Wikipedia language editions? We really had no idea whether they were just copies of English that were kind of happening, or whether they actually had different content, or how that content differed, or anything around that. And you could think of really two major kind of opposing hypotheses. Like the truth is always somewhere in the middle, but when we think about this, there's an easy way to think about this. One is this sort of global consensus hypothesis, and this is the idea that every language's encyclopedic world knowledge should cover roughly the same concepts, and it should do so in nearly the same way, right? And this is an implicit assumption that's used by a lot of systems. So Microsoft Research Wikibasha makes this assumption. It's just automatically translating data from one area to another. Things like information arbitrage, which is an approach to sort of move data from one language edition to another, they assume that the structure and the way the content is being represented should pretty much be similar. This is contrasted with what I think most of us as social scientists would think is a better perspective, which is the global diversity perspective, where we say that this is much more consistent, I think, with the social science positions, where we consider cultural knowledge production and cultural knowledge representation. Right? It assumes there's major differences, and that these differences need to be treated as such, and as both meaningful and important distinctions that we have across these language editions. So this is a little bit more of the kind of critique or the approach that we came to this work with. So the first way that we wanted to investigate this, and the first sort of bias or potential area for diversity that we wanted to look at, is what I'm going to call topical coverage biases. So these are biases in whether or not a topic is being covered across the language editions. So if we go to a Wikipedia page, we can think about topical coverage occurring in a couple of different ways. So this is the chocolate page in English, and the chocolate page in maybe Danish, I believe, or German. So we have a concept, which is the article topic, and what I'm going to refer to as a subconcept or the article body. So we can think about diversity happening at these two levels. Either the page exists or it doesn't in different language editions, and when it exists, what's being written about it, what's being said about it, right? So these are two ways we can begin to think about the diversity of the content that's on these pages. And I'll start with some studies that we did to try to investigate and understand the degree of conceptual diversity that exists across language editions. So our corpus started with 25 language editions, the largest 25 at the time. We had about 18 million articles that we were looking at, about a little over 1 billion links, and this was about 280 gigabytes of raw data. English was the largest that we were looking at, so this was around 4 million articles and 295 or 94 million links. Hebrew was the smallest. It was only 142,000 articles and only 10 million links. Right? But this was sort of a multilingual corpus, and here we're capturing all of the data that exists. Right? So we're not sampling. This is the full data set. And what we want to do then is we need a way to take a page that looks something like this and convert it into a more general language-neutral concept for, in this case, what is ID 4042, but in English we would call this concept chocolate. Right? So we were trying to sort of take a page in an existing language and build up a data structure that it could eventually become a universal concept or a language-neutral concept for, in what we would call English, chocolate, and in French it's chocolat, and maybe chocolate in German. Right? So we have a way to sort of take all of these different pages and know that this construct of chocolate is being represented by those. So the first thing we need to do is come up with a way to develop this data structure before we can begin to analyze the degree of overlap and the amount of uniqueness that exists across language editions. And one of the ways that we do this is we make use of something called the interlanguage link graph. So if you look at a Wikipedia page, on the left-hand side, you'll see links to all the other languages that it exists in. So if you think of a Wikipedia language edition as a big graph, right? You have all of your articles, you have the links between those articles. This would be English, then you have French, German, Spanish, and so on and so forth. The interlanguage links connect across them. So basically the page on bread in English is linked to the page of bread in French. Right? So the interlanguage link graph gives us a way to traverse across the language editions. And what we can then do is we can traverse that interlanguage link graph, and we can begin to identify things like this, what are called missing links. So our approach is what we call a hyperlingual approach. Instead of just doing pairwise comparisons, we're taking the whole set of languages, and this is a kind of a fabricated example, but imagine we have chocolate in English and it connects to Hebrew and Danish, but chocolate in Spanish and English don't connect. There should be a connection here. We can sort of infer that missing link. So the missing link problem is one of the first kind of challenges methodologically that we faced. But using this interlanguage link approach and this hyperlingual approach, we can actually detect some of these missing links. So that allows us to address one of the first challenges we had, which is the missing link challenge. But the side effect of it is that it gives us this other problem, which I call conceptual drift. And so while the missing link challenge, we saw an example of how we get around that, the side effect of solving that is that we get to this conceptual drift problem. And you can think of conceptual drift, it stems from sort of a well-known finding in cognitive science where the boundaries of concepts vary across language-defined communities. Right? So one way to think about this is kind of a semantic equivalent of something like the children's game of telephone. So if I was going to sort of come over to the corner here and I would sort of whisper, Seattle is very sunny, and then they would sort of pass that along and whisper it all the way through, right? And when it came back to me, maybe I heard, see, it's very funny, right? So you get this sort of like subtle sort of shift that's happening as you're sort of traversing the graph where you're sort of moving in space. And we're getting that happening kind of at a semantic level. So here's kind of a concrete example of this. So we have river in English. It links to the German page on river. The German page on river links to canal in English. The canal page in English links to the French page on canal, which also links to the canyon in English, and so on and so forth. And eventually we get this really big cluster where we have included in sort of river and canal things like rain gutter and trench warfare. Right? So we get this problem that by solving the missing link problem, we now begin to get these big clusters of concepts that don't have a whole lot of conceptual clarity to them. So I'm not going to go into it in detail, but we have an algorithm that we talk about in our paper called Conceptual Line that really uses two things to help prune that graph. So the first one is we limit the number of edges from a given language that can point to the same article in another language. And we require a certain percentage of languages to agree on an edge in order for it to remain. Right? And this basically allows us to prune the graph a little bit. So we can kind of cut off sort of the egregious parts, and we have a term that we refer to as conceptual clarity, which is, and we can validate that through like human studies, multilingual human studies, where we validate the conceptual clarity that we have. So now we have a way to basically go from these pages to get to a data structure that looks something like this. And now we can sort of investigate how this is going to play out across language editions. So after we parsed the 25 different database dumps from the 25 language editions, we aligned all 11 million pages and their corresponding concepts. What did we find? Well, we found that the archetypical concept looked really nothing like chocolate. And in fact, it looked much more like this, a single language concept of the main pedestrian thoroughfare in Glasgow called Sauchiehall Street, or Hillbilly Jedi. Any country fans in the audience? That's the usual reaction when I give this talk. So it's a regional music form, right? But it's also was the number 4 on the country music Billboard. It sold hundreds of thousands of albums, so it's actually a relatively big deal. But it's only showing up in the English Wikipedia. And does anybody know this? Any Germans in the audience? Who is this? Any guesses? No guesses. So this is a German politician, a member of the Brandenburg Parliament by the name of Dieter Gross. Sometimes I give partial credit if you guess Gandalf the Grey. I know some of you were thinking it. You just didn't want to say it. Okay, so when we look across the distribution of our languages, here we have on the x-axis the number of languages, so we go from 1 up to 25. And this is the number of concepts that are appearing. And what we see is that the vast, vast majority of the content across language editions only exists in a single language edition of Wikipedia. Right? So they look like Sauchiehall Street, they look like Hillbilly Jedi, they look like Dieter Gross. And in fact, less than 1/10 of 1% of the concepts exist in all 25 languages. Right? So a really, really small amount of data that's appearing across all these language editions. And this is a very robust finding. So even if we look at something like the largest 3 Wikipedias, we still see that about 78 or 79% of the concepts are single language, and only 8% of those concepts exist across all 3. So we have lots of ways that we can kind of parse the data and look at it to test for where these differences and distinctions might be coming from. Now, one counter-argument that we get when we look at this is what we refer to as the English as superset corollary. This is the idea that English is the largest, and everything else is kind of a subset of English, right? So imagine just like these circles, basically, for every language as it gets smaller and smaller, are all kind of contained within here, and all of those unique ones are basically English, right? And I think that's a reasonable counter-argument, but when we look at the actual data and we pull it apart pairwise, what we actually see is this. So these are the 2 largest Wikipedia language editions. This is English and German. And we see that around 48% of German concepts are not existing in the English Wikipedia. Similarly, if we look at similar size, so French and German, we see that only about 33 to 35% of the concepts exist in both of these language editions. So when we sort of start to tease these apart and look at them in a pairwise fashion, we see a whole heck of a lot of unique information across language editions. There are what I would refer to as global concepts, right? So there were certainly a small percentage of these global concepts that appeared in all 25 language editions. Some of this is like great to see, right? We've got Einstein, we've got Oprah, we've got the Nobel. Some of it's a little more depressing. We've got FIFA and maybe Britney Spears, I think. Not necessarily depressing, but I'd like to think that global concepts and constructs were a little bit richer in some ways. But you can also imagine that while we have these things being represented across these language editions, what's being written about them or what's being said about them, there's no guarantee that they're being talked about in the same way. And in fact, you could certainly imagine a case where I think opinions varied greatly, such as with artificial sweeteners. I'll let you decide which image I'm referring to there. So the second study that we wanted to do was to try to get at this notion of sub-concept diversity, right? So let's assume the page exists. What's being written about it? What's being said about that? The technique we came up to work with this was derived from Adafra and Derike. So we collected a sample of 217,000 same concept page pairs. These were drawn from our list of global concepts, so some of those pictures that you saw before. And then we wanted to determine the average degree of diversity or overlap that existed in the page content that's being written about them. So the way we do this is we build on this technique, as I mentioned, by Adafra and Derike, where we use the links on the page as a heuristic representation of the topics that are being discussed and content. And this is really effective in Wikipedia, right? Because these are links to other Wikipedia pages that have significant content around them. So it's a way to give us a really quick heuristic representation of page content. So we extract these, and this is the page on chocolate, and when we extract the links, here's what we see. Mexico, Mesoamerica, Aztec, cocoa butter, chocolate, white chocolate, eggs, Easter, Africa, right? So it gives us a heuristic representation of page content. Once we have that, and this is why our universal IDs are useful as well, we can convert that into our universal IDs. We can then generate that across language editions, right? So we have the list for the chocolate page in English, we have it for Hebrew, we have it for Spanish, and then we can begin to investigate the degree of overlap at the sort of sub-concept or the article body level. So we use a pretty simple statistic, just called an overlap coefficient, and this is essentially the size of the intersection of the link sets over the smaller of the link sets. So in other words, it's the percentage of the links contained on the smaller page that also are contained within the larger of the two articles. So to give you an example of how this works, so let's imagine we have English page on chocolate, Hebrew page on chocolate, and the Hebrew page is smaller. In actuality, these are really long lists. But let's say everything that was mentioned on the Hebrew page is also mentioned on the English. So the size of the intersection would be 4. The number on the smaller page would be 4. We'd have an overlap coefficient of 1. If we do the same thing for Spanish, so it has slightly more, but not so much overlap. We have 2 things that are mentioned on both the Spanish and the English page, and the Spanish in the denominator is going to be 6. We get an overlap coefficient of 0.33. So this just gives us kind of an efficient way to look across the entire data sets and to understand the amount of overlap that's happening across language editions. So then we calculate this overlap coefficient across languages, and here's what we see. So this is the percentage of the shorter links covered by the longer, from 0 to 1, and essentially the number of sample pairs is a very large number. And we see a mean overlap coefficient of 0.41. So what this means is that, on average, about 59% of the shorter articles' links don't appear in the longer articles' link set. Right? So even at the sub-concept diversity level, what's being written about these topics, we're seeing a great deal of variability and diversity across those. And we see a few cases where they're getting kind of, they're almost full coverage, but also a lot of cases where there's very little of that content that's being covered in the larger article. So that's topical biases. Another form of bias that we might think about or look for in these language editions are what I call lexical biases. And so lexical biases have to do with the particular words or phrases or expressions that are being chosen by the editors when they're editing these articles. And here I'm actually going to talk about work that's not mine, but I think is really nice by Jana Otterbacher and Claudia Wagner, where they have a nice example of this. And in particular, they use a theory of linguistic intergroup bias that basically talks about the ways in which abstract terms can be used to generalize positive attributes, positive actions, and positive behaviors. And what Claudia Wagner and her colleagues show is that abstract terms tend to be used more often to describe positive aspects in the biographies of men and negative aspects in the biographies of women. So they're seeing this sort of like gender differentiation in the way they're using these abstract terms, which generalize about those properties of those individuals. So in other words, Wikipedia editors tend to generalize men's successes, but not their failures. And at the same time, for the women editors, they tend to generalize their failures, but not their successes. Right? So the failure in this case is like, oh yeah, of course it was a failure, and the success is a unique instance of, and it's the exact flip for the male biographies. So we're seeing the editors kind of imposing some of these stereotypes and these biases into the type of language that they're using to describe things. And we see this in a number of ways. We see this in biographical articles about women as well. This is more work by Claudia and colleagues, where they emphasize things in biographies about women that they're actually women, that they're female. They more often mention things like family and children. Right? So the content that they're putting in there is actually shifting. And this is sort of controlling for things like this is both medical doctors, male and female medical doctors. They're controlling for sort of the areas that they're in. And relatedly, David Baman and Noah Smith at Carnegie Mellon showed that biographies of women disproportionately discuss things like marriage and divorce in comparison to, somewhat controlled comparisons for men. So in short, what we see is that when these editorial communities are crafting encyclopedic entries, they can introduce lexical biases that essentially reflect their personal stereotypes and social biases. And we know that the editors for Wikipedia are massively skewed to the male side. Right? So I think one of the arguments for this kind of theoretically is that we're getting some of those kind of latent in-group, out-group kinds of things, or there's something about the editorial composition that is sort of just getting these biases embedded into the language and the descriptions that are happening. A third kind of bias that is particularly challenging, and I think this is maybe the worst because it's the hardest to see, is what I refer to as a structural bias. So a structural bias is a bias in how the topics are actually linked to or embedded in other topics. And one structural bias that we've examined is what we call self-focus bias. So self-focus bias was we were trying to examine the degree to which these language-based cultures center their descriptions around objects and entities of regional interest. So I really like this picture from the New Yorker. I think it makes clear kind of what this idea is about. So this is the New Yorker's view of the world. And everything that's close to them is much more salient, and things that are far away are much less salient. So I'm a New Yorker. I've got 9th Avenue, 10th Avenue, Hudson River. I've got this little sliver of some brown thing called Jersey. Maybe then there's Chicago, Pacific Ocean, Japan, Russia, China. Right? So as things get further and further away, they need to be more and more salient in order to sort of show up in your mapping of the information space. And another way to think about this is if I'm an editor from Chicago, and I'm talking about the New York City's Empire State Building, I might describe that relative to American architects. I might describe it relative to its size, relative to the Sears Tower in Chicago, or what's known as the Willis Tower now in Chicago. Whereas if I'm a Parisian, I might talk about that same thing, but I might compare it to French architects that had influence on that, or the Eiffel Tower as far as its scale and its size, right? So we were trying to come up with a way to examine this self-focus bias, or this geographic regional bias in the information representation. And I'm not arguing that biases are bad. I think these are actually quite useful from a learning perspective because we associate it to things that we know. But I think we need to understand how they're characterized and what exactly they entail. So one of the ways we started to do this is we made use of some geotagged articles in Wikipedia. So if you go to Wikipedia and it's a spatial entity, there's a lot of articles, actually a very large proportion, that are tagged with essentially latitude and longitude coordinates. So we have geotagged articles within Wikipedia. And this was our data set. We had about 9 million geotagged articles, about 217 million links across 15 Wikipedia language editions. So you can see we're sort of drawing examples from kind of all around the world. And we're going to come up with apply a technique from geography to help us understand this extent or this degree of self-focus bias. So a technique we use is something called a spatial in-degree sum. I'm sorry, yep.
What is the geotag location telling you about the article?
It gives you the latitude and longitude. So these are just spatial entities. So these would be things like either kind of regions, cities, in which case you're going to kind of midpoints, or if you had something like a sculpture, it would be like where it's located on Earth, right? Latitude. Of the object of the article that's being entered. Yeah, not the editors. Yep, sorry. Okay, thanks. It's an important clarification. Yeah, so we're using spatial in-degree sums, and what this does is essentially it measures a geographic region and how much it's being discussed, right? And you can think of this as kind of a simple measure of something like geographic network centrality. So we have a geographic region. In this case, we're going to talk about Poland. And we have pages that are sort of entities that reside within this geographic region. So Szczecin and Warsaw. There's actually many more cities in Poland, but this is a simple example, so let's start there. And then we look across the entire rest of the Wikipedia, and we see the extent to which the rest of the content in the Wikipedia is linking to the objects that are located within this geographic boundary, right? So here for Warsaw, we have Pope John Paul II. For Szczecin, we have the Red Army. We have a number of things that are linking to entities that reside within these geographic regions. We can then calculate the in-degree sum, and we do this by language addition. So for Poland, for instance, this would have an in-degree sum of 8. But we could then look at something like the English Wikipedia, and we might see that there's only an in-degree sum of 2, right? So there's only 2 other articles that are linking to these articles that reside within this geographic space. And what this gives us is a way to sort of measure the degree to which the entire language edition of that Wikipedia is more or less centralized around certain geographic regions. And we get a very stark result. So this is the German Wikipedia. We see that here, entities within Germany are like 7 times more likely than the next likely, which is the United States. We see similar results, twice as much for Finland, Japanese, about almost 5 times as much. So we're seeing a great degree of geographic centralization across language editions. And I think a better way to actually look at this is to actually use maps. So this is the Polish Wikipedia. You can see that here Poland is significantly more likely than any other geographic region to accrue in degree from the rest of the articles in the language edition. This is the Russian Wikipedia. That's the Japanese Wikipedia. So it's a very kind of robust and significant finding across language editions. We tend to see that. The really nice thing about this approach is we can also change the geographic scale. So here we can look at North America. We're looking at states and provinces, and this is the English Wikipedia. So we see, surprise, surprise, California is the most important state, at least in sort of what's being talked about and what's being mentioned from a geographic perspective. New York and Pennsylvania are important as well. But what do you think is going to happen when we switch to the French Wikipedia? Yeah, Quebec. Boom, right? So when we use the same analysis and we switch to the French Wikipedia, now we suddenly see California, yeah, still important, okay. But Quebec becomes very important, right? So there's regions, we get these kind of regional shifts in the representation of that information that is kind of coming through from this analysis. There's lots of other ways we can think about structural biases. We've done some work to look at kind of core-periphery distinctions. So is the bulk of this diversity happening in the pages that are, not visited very often or things that are not very kind of important topically? Or is it happening in the core, which are sort of, topics that are being talked about and linked to a lot of other kind of topical areas? And actually we see a little bit of a shift towards the periphery, but still a massive, massive amount of this diversity is happening in the core of these language editions. So I don't have time to go into detail of some of those analyses, but if you're interested, I can point you to some of the papers. And another thing that Claudia Wagner's group showed as well, too, is that we also have biases in sort of gender-based linking strategies. So one of the things that they showed here is that men are disproportionately represented across all articles in the English, Russian, and German Wikipedias in comparison to some other languages. And it's really important to notice here that it's not simply that more men are covered. It's that other topics and articles mention those men more frequently and at greater rates than would be expected given the overall proportion. So we might have 100 articles of male doctors, 50 articles of female doctors, yet it's much more than 2 to 1 in the mentions for other articles throughout the Wikipedia. Right? So we have these sort of structural embeddings and gender biases that are also showing up in the way the information is kind of structured and linked. Okay. So at this point, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the effects that these biases have on end-user technologies. So you recall when I first started talking, I mentioned that we have these studies of Wikipedia data, but we also use a lot of these data in AI and natural language processing systems. So the question we set out to ask here is, what are the implications of content and structural diversity and biases for existing technologies? So they take Wikipedia data structures, they process them, and they produce some output. And what we want to know is if we're sort of changing or altering the data that's going into these, and we're controlling for the algorithm, it's the same algorithm, are we going to get different outputs on the end? So if we think about this back in terms of the global consensus argument would say it doesn't matter which language edition we seed these algorithms with, we'll get similar outputs on the output side. The global diversity perspective would say it really matters what language edition we feed into the system because we're going to get very different outputs on the output side, right? And so if the differences in these linking structures, if the differences in these content are having influence, they're going to influence our downstream systems that are making use of Wikipedia data structures. So one simple way that we tested this, we built out a version of explicit semantic analysis, which just gives us something called semantic relatedness. So what semantic relatedness does is it tells us how related two concepts are. So bread and peanut butter, right? And it gives us a relatedness measure on something between 0 and 1. So this is I like this example because you can think bread and peanut butter in English Wikipedia is likely to have some correlation, right? We have peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. We put peanut butter on bread. We do a number of these things that would maybe sort of through other pages accrue some linkages between them. You could also think about this if you're from UW of vinyl and PVC. In the University of Washington. So those of you who know your UW folklore, right, this is a non-zero correlation. PVC and vinyl were invented in part at the University of Washington. And we get some number out of that. So what we want to do then is we're going to take this ESA implementation, we're going to seed it with English, we're going to seed it with German, and we're going to seed it with Spanish, and we're going to compare the correlation we get across concepts. And we're going to look at a bunch of different concepts to see if we're getting different results. So another way to think about this is, would the scores be the same for bread and peanut butter if we looked at it in English versus German versus Spanish, and so on? And we do this across 2,000 concept pairs. And essentially, if global diversity were not an issue, we would expect that all of these columns would be pretty highly correlated. So the ESA output for English should be highly correlated to the ESA output for French and German and French, and so on and so forth. When we run this and we do all of these comparisons, what we actually see is that the average pairwise ESA correlation across all 10 language editions is only 0.18, right? So really kind of low distribution on the correlation of the outcomes that we get when we seed this same algorithm with very different data. So a lot of the literature that critiques algorithms talks about the problems in the algorithms, but it's also the data that are being processed by those algorithms that are leading to a lot of the biases in the output. And I think that's what we demonstrate pretty starkly here. And here's kind of an example of how this plays out when we do something like search and retrieval. So this is a search term for the Chinese Communist Party. And these are the top result sets in the Chinese and English relative to that. So what we see is that in English and also in Spanish, you see many more historical events and many more figures of prominence. So both Mao Zedong, the Chinese Civil War, and the Cultural Revolution are highly related constructs to the Chinese Communist Party in the English Wikipedia. But in the Chinese Wikipedia, there's a tendency for many more modern events to show up and to appear, as well as more detailed aspects of the current party system. So 3 represents is a socio-political theory that was credited to Zheng Zemin in around the early 2000s. And Shuangwei is an internal disciplinary process that's often for party members suspected of corruption. Right? So we're getting very different results based on the data that we're seeing these with when we're searching for a similar term. So this is showing it as these get implemented into our technical systems, even things like search and retrieval systems, we can get very different responses back from them when we begin to sort of process and think about it. So across all of this work, we show that there's a serious concern, I think, for Wikipedia-based technologies. Things like semantic relatedness, information retrieval, topic detection, and clustering can all be influenced. But it's also an opportunity, I'd argue. And it's an opportunity for designing and developing what I'd call culturally aware applications. So in this last part of the talk, what I want to do is briefly present kind of a new class of technologies that we're thinking about that are enabled by this diversity of representations that exists in these peer-produced venues. So the challenge we have is that we have siloed information because of these language barriers. But the opportunity we have is that we have a huge repository of really diverse knowledge and world knowledge. And what we were thinking is we could set out a way to sort of demonstrate this and to actually show this to end users. So we developed a system called Manypedia. And what it does is it provides access to over 8 million different concepts in 25 language editions. And the goal was to highlight kind of the similarities and the differences between the different language editions. So here's an example of how it works. So you put in the topic that you're interested in. So here we put in conspiracy theory. And then we have the 25 language editions that kind of are default for the system. And we get essentially a visualization that comes out of this. And when you look at this, what each of these dots are a unique topic that's being mentioned on the conspiracy theory page in all of these different languages. So these are the unique topics being mentioned in German. These are the unique topics being mentioned in English and Spanish and so on and so forth. And then if you mouse over a particular node, you can actually see what that topic is. So on the Chinese Wikipedia, on the conspiracy theory page, they mention the topic of the progress of the SARS outbreak. Right? So that's a unique thing that's being mentioned on the conspiracy theory page in China, that's in Chinese, that's not being mentioned in other language editions. In Hebrew, one of my all-time favorites, Microsoft Windows gets mentioned on the conspiracy theory page, and this is only in the Hebrew Wikipedia. And so when you click on that node, what we do is we do snippet extraction, we pull out that piece of text, and we actually have to do a little translation there where we try to tell you what it is that's actually happening. And it turns out that on the Hebrew conspiracy theory page, there's a description of Microsoft Windows that says, essentially, Bill Gates, or whoever is in control of Microsoft at the time, put a bunch of latent code into their operating systems that allows them to sort of take down the systems. So if the US goes to war with anybody in the Middle East, all they have to do is call up whoever's leading Microsoft at the time, and they flip a switch, and all the Windows machines in that area crash. Right? So the actual joke there is that you have to flip a switch to make Windows crash. But apologies to any Redmond folks in the audience. Right, but I think it's interesting because it gives us kind of a concrete example of the ways in which these topics are being talked about and thought about in different ways. And what we want to do is not hide that. Don't say, oh, this only exists in this language, so 3 other languages don't talk about this, so we're not going to have it, which is the way a lot of systems would work. But we actually want to sort of expose that to the users and allow them to sort of see it and understand it. We can also see the topics mentioned in 2 languages and 3 languages, and so on and so forth. The other thing, and the reason for this visualization, is we wanted to make it clear sort of what the extent of the diversity is kind of across all of the language editions. And you can also get over, if you sort of zoomed all the way to the right, you see the really popular ones. So these are the global concepts around conspiracy theory. And you see a lot of things we might expect. Moon landing conspiracy theories, Freemasonry, September 11th attacks, John F. Kennedy. Right? These are things that are being mentioned on multiple language editions. But if you recall the earlier work that we did, just because the pages exist doesn't mean that what's being written about those pages is necessarily the same. So if you click on one of these nodes, you basically, we extract the snippet around each of those topics so that you can actually compare the mentions across the different language editions. So we can see the moon landing conspiracy theory as it's talked about on the English page, the Spanish page, the French page, and so on, and get them all kind of in context and together. So instead of sort of giving one solution, we're exposing the differences and distinctions and letting the end user see that. A couple of other things you can do with the system. You can adjust which language editions you show, and you can also allow people to sort of switch it and localize it into whatever language they want. This is nice because we basically get it for free because of our hyperlingual approach. So we switch it into Spanish, everything kind of automatically changes for us. So I don't have time to talk about the studies of this, but we have run numerous studies of Manypedia and what people can kind of gain and understand from it. And a couple of things that really stand out is they use Manypedia to really kind of discover information that's unique to single languages, and we were able to sort of capture that they record many more novel and deeper insights about some of the topics that they were looking at. They do things like investigate stereotypes. So one user did a really interesting thing, which is they came into it thinking, oh, so the company Siemens did a lot of the building of machinery in World War II for Germany, and they assumed that the German Wikipedia wouldn't talk about that, right? That it would be sort of not as exposed there as it was in other language editions. But actually, when they used this, they found out that it was the exact opposite, right? That was one of the most densely populated areas. It was talked about in much greater length and to a much greater extent than other language editions. And we wouldn't necessarily be able to get that as a single language user of Wikipedias, but we can actually begin to see some of these distinctions and expose them to the end users. So this is what I've been thinking about, ways in which we can actually retain these distinctions and differences and make them available to people as opposed to sort of repressing them or hiding them in the systems that we develop. And just one last mention, I'd like to close by saying that we've been working with, both in our lab and other labs to make available a lot of the tools that we use that serve as the technical underpinnings for this work. We initially released this, a lot of the things that allow us to do multilingual efforts as Wikipedia, an API for Wikipedia. Worst name ever. It gets auto-corrected. You can't actually search for it. It just tries to take you to Wikipedia every time you do it. So that was a pretty big mistake. It's now known as Wikibrain, and it's being developed primarily by Shalad Sen, who's at Macalester, and some of our colleagues at GroupLens, and Brent Hecht at Northwestern, who was also a student in my lab before. So Wikibrain basically it supports all Wikipedia language editions. You can download and organize the Wikipedia data sets and load them automatically into databases. It also has kind of embedded semantic relatedness algorithms if you want to measure the relationship between different constructs. And we're not the only people that are doing this kind of work. There's a really nice piece called Manypedia by Paulo Massa, where he talks about linguistic points of view. And this is just a pairwise browser, but it lets you look at 2 articles in 2 languages. So this is the Osama bin Laden page in English, the Osama bin Laden page in Arabic, translated into English. And you can have them side by side. You can go back to the original text. The idea is that you can then, as an analyst, begin to look at these data, compare them, see what's being written, see how it's being sort of written in different ways. So we did a very macro level with Omnipedia. Manypedia lets you zoom in very specifically. So you could see using these 2 systems in tandem. And then finally, there's another piece called Pantheon from MIT Media Lab by Cesar Hidalgo and Amy Yu, where they're trying to sort of visualize globally famous biographies and talk about cultural production over time. And what they do is they look across language editions and they see who the most popular people are from different regions and different areas, and then they kind of expose that through a visualization. So I think this is also really nice. So this is the rest of the world's view on German academics and sociologists. So Weber and Simmel become very kind of popular people that are known sort of globally from those regions. And so that's another nice example, I think, of giving us a lens into other cultures' perspectives on this information. So with that, I'd like to close, but I don't want to do so without thanking 3 of the former students that did a lot of work on this. So Brent Hecht, who's now was a professor at Minnesota, is now at Northwestern again. Patty Bao, who's at Google, and Jim Maddock, actually a University of Washington undergraduate who's in my lab and currently working on some of this research. And here's a number of the papers that I've drawn some of this content from. So with that, I'll close and happy to take questions.
But I guess you should keep the questions, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So do you have any insight into how the balance between global consensus and global diversity is changing over time?
Yes. So we've done versions of these studies in 2009, 2012, and 2015. And actually what we see is that balance is basically the same. So you're getting growth overall. Everything's getting bigger, but proportionally that balance is basically staying the same. And so, I mean, some things that I really, really want us to do that we haven't been able to do yet is to kind of take a temporal view of this and look at when new topics show up in one language, do they then sort of show up later on in other languages, and what's the extent to which there's sort of influence going across the kind of language editions as you run through them in time. It's really challenging computationally to do a static single time shot across 25 language editions. We haven't quite yet gotten our heads around doing kind of a temporal unfolding. But I think that's the exact question to be thinking about and to be asking is because we want to start to understand what we've really done here is, this is still, even though it's a fair amount of work, it's still pretty preliminary, right? We've documented that this exists, but we haven't talked about why or how or what's happening kind of in the editorial patterns, and is it consistent across things like I was talking actually earlier with some people thinking about like breaking news versus static historical pages, and do we see differences in different areas of the category trees and things like that. I think that's a level of richness that really needs to be kind of understood and explored before we really kind of know exactly what's happening and why it's happening. Right? Yeah.
I have a couple of sort of Wikipedia geekish remarks / questions.
Okay.
One is, I think, and I don't know if this is something you would think you should be controlling for. In some cases, there are types of things that by policy, one Wikipedia tends to link and another doesn't. For example, some of them link a date every time.
Yep.
And some of them never do that.
Yep.
Or another example is that somebody, every time the word lawyer comes up, it would be linked, and in others, that is not a word you would link unless it was in a concept where it was highly relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of the biases are going to be different, or you're going to detect a policy difference.
Yep.
And I was wondering if you've done anything to try to control it all for
Yep.
policy difference and where that's taking you.
Yep. Yeah, so that's also a very good question. I didn't get into the nuts and bolts of a lot of it. Dates are a big problem, and so we actually we remove dates and linkage strategies from a lot of the analyses that we do, because there's very big differences in policy on date linking. The latter point that you mentioned, though, the lawyers one, is a little bit harder. We have done some things where we basically kind of go through a Wikifcation process and we try to identify topics that are being mentioned on the pages that aren't actually being linked, so that we can kind of bolster that as well too. And we still see, the percentages shift a little bit, but the general patterns seem to retain.
And the other related thing, this is something I know a lot from doing translations, is the thing where when you're translating, you often have a need to introduce a piece of context that's needed for somebody who's not in the language that a person is. For example, if you're writing about a Romanian author,
Yep.
and you allude to another, you need to fill in some things for an English speaker that would be givens for a Romanian speaker that you wouldn't even think to mention.
Yep.
And
I think that's probably part of the diversity that we're seeing, and I think that's why I would argue this is really important, right? If we just do wholesale translation, we lose that. We lose a lot of the contextualization that we need as a consumer of a page to understand it. If it's not part of our local region, or if it's not a topic that we sort of know, right? Think about, we were talking earlier too about like baseball and cricket, right? If there's certain things that you need to introduce for somebody to understand that concept, we need more content there. And so just sort of blindly translating across the different language editions isn't going to give us that contextualization that we need. But I think that's exactly the point, and that's the richness that we need to think about, especially when we start to think about automated processes for doing information arbitrage and propagation. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh. Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Sorry. Was it
I think.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No, that's fine. We'll get there.
This might be beyond the scope of this, but I think a barrier that at least I and probably a lot of people have run into when trying to make a new Wikipedia article is it needs to be notable. And so, would you guess that there are cultural differences in what people think is a notable thing, like just because it's in some document Wikipedia? Is it notable enough to be an English Wikipedia?
Yep. Yes, I absolutely think that's part of it as well too, is sort of the notability differences. And you guys are sort of putting your fingers on all the things that, we're trying to do sort of a really sort of macro level analysis here. But what I want to do is like interview, surveys, talk to people that are sort of bilingual that are doing these things and start to get a richer understanding of that. We've done a lot of work to look at kind of policy things, but notable is something that varies, and notable also varies by culture. Right? So what is notable is going to be something that's going to vary by culture. So we wouldn't necessarily expect it to be kind of systematic. Neutral point of view is also something that, while it's part of the ethos of Wikipedia, it's viewed very differently in different cultures and by different editing communities as to what exactly that means. Right? And so those are things that I think help to drive this diversity and these differences. And I think we need to retain that, right? If we get rid of that, we're going to sort of destroy a lot of these communities that are doing this editing.
Maybe one more.
Maybe in the back, I think.
Now and then on an article I've seen, originally in English translated to the German and so forth. So it seems like you could automate looking for articles that have been translated. Similarly, there must be kinds of tracking going on where you could monitor that by the edit history and notice there was a localized edit in the German version and then it appeared in the English version. So have you been doing that kind of thing? And more generally, what about all the cross-pollination that's going on as opposed to these things just growing independently?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we haven't computationally sort of been looking at ways to look at that cross-pollination, but it's something that we're very interested in doing, right? It's just, as I mentioned earlier, it's one of the things that's a little harder for us to get around because you actually have to be sort of tracking full content and you have to be tracking it over time. But we have done some things where we've detected, so we did one analysis where we detected sort of big changes, big basically dumps that were coming in kind of new topic spaces. And then we could compare that to sort of existing languages that had kind of big components. And one process that you tend to see that's pretty common is they'll take the English page, they'll dump it into the local language, and then they'll point the community at it and they'll sort of contextualize it and localize it, right? So the first movement is actually almost like a straight translation, and then there's this sort of like fixing up, cleaning up. And then often if you go to the talk pages, there's debates about like, should we really even have this, right? Like, this form of food is not something that we really even need on this language edition. But so we can see some of those patterns happening where you're getting these kind of movement. But we haven't yet done it kind of systematically across the language editions.
Okay, so I think that if everything's gone planned, there's reception, there's some food and drinks immediately outside the door, but we have this room as well, so we can continue to hang out outside or in the space as well. So another round of applause.